By the time the caravan reached the oasis, the sun was already slipping lower, scattering its last golden rays over the clustered palms. The winter here was not the biting frost of the northern steppes, nor the heavy snows of the mountains, but a gentler cold, the kind that crept into your bones slowly and made you long for the steam of tea and the glow of coals. Yet even this mild desert winter could turn sharp after sunset, and so the arrival at the oasis was met with a quiet relief. Oasis lay in a shallow depression, a gift of the earth cupped between low, wind-smoothed ridges of sand. Tall date palms, their trunks wrapped in rough brown scales, swayed gently in the breeze. Beneath them the ground was a patchwork of sand and dark, damp soil. A spring bubbled up near the center, its water caught in a shallow pool lined with stones blackened by time. Ripples shimmered in the fading light, and the faint sound of trickling water was like a lullaby after days of wind-whipped silence. The tribe had camped here many times before. Some of the elders remembered winters spent under these very palms when they themselves had been children. It was a place of stories, of long-ago meetings between trading caravans, of songs shared by strangers who parted the next morning, of unexpected rainstorms that had filled the pool to its brim dot as soon as the camels were unburdened. The work began. Tents were pitched in a loose semicircle facing the water, the open sides turned toward the low winter sun to catch what warmth remained. Fires were lit quickly, the smell of smoke mingling with the sweet scent of dried palm fronds that were fed into the flames. Pottery jars were lowered into the spring to draw water, and children carried them carefully back to the camp, their bare feet padding softly on the packed earth. The meal this night was more plentiful than usual. A small goat had been brought for just such an occasion, and it was slaughtered and prepared with quiet reverence. Its meat simmered slowly in a pot, with onions, cumin, and cinnamon, the aroma filling the cool air and drawing people closer to the hearth. Flatbreads were kneaded and baked on iron plates, their surfaces blistering and browning in the heat. A pot of sweet tea brewed nearby, the scent of cardamom and sugar curling upward in invisible ribbons. When the meal was done and the bowls had been licked clean, the evening stretched out before them. There was no urgency here, no pressing need to move on until the supplies of water and forage began to run thin. People sat in easy circles, their backs resting against folded saddle blankets. Someone brought out a small drum, its skin taut and resonant, and began to tap a slow rhythm. Another took up a flute carved from reed, its notes winding into the night like threads of silver. The sky above the oasis was different from the wide-open heavens of the open desert, the palms framed, the stars breaking them into glimpses between the fronds. The moon hung low, casting shadows that swayed and shifted as the wind stirred the leaves. The firelight flickered on faces, turning every wrinkle and furrow into a map of years and miles traveled. Here, in this sheltered hollow, the cold seemed less sharp. The ground, warmed by the day's sun, released its heat slowly, and the breeze was softened by the trees, Children curled up on rugs, their heads pillowed on rolled cloaks, listening to the murmur of conversation and the faint, ever-present trickle of the spring dot stories rose like embers into the air. The elders spoke of a time when the oasis had been the site of a great market, where goods from far-off coasts and mountain valleys had been traded, turquoise for frankincense, wool for copper, honey for salt. They spoke of a woman who had once come alone, leading a single camel laden with nothing but jars of water, and had left with a caravan bound for the sea. They spoke of rains that had come unexpectedly one winter, drumming on the tents until dawn, and of the laughter that had echoed under the dripping palms dot as the night deepened. The sounds grew fewer. The fire settled into a bed of glowing coals. The music faded into silence, and the only movement was the slow rocking of the palm fronds. Above, the stars shifted, their positions marking the passing hours. The moon dipped lower, casting its pale reflection into the still water of the spring dot. In this moment, the oasis felt eternal. The desert beyond might shift and change, swallowing tracks and reshaping dunes, but here the water would always rise from the earth. The palms would always reach for the sky, and the wind would always carry the same soft, cool whisper. It was a place outside of time, a pause in the endless journey, a reminder that even in the most barren landscapes, there could be a pocket of warmth, of community, of life. And so the tribe slept wrapped in the scent of wood smoke and cardamom, under a sky laced with stars and palm shadows. The desert waited beyond the ridges, but tonight it was kept at bay by the circle of light and the promise of water. The desert is not simply empty space. It is a slow-moving sea. Its waves are not water, but dunes, vast, golden, and always changing shape. To cross them is to step into a world where distance plays tricks on the eyes, where heat bends the horizon, and where every grain of sand seems to remember the footsteps of those who came before. For the nomadic tribes, the road between oases is not a straight line, nor even a road at all. It is a thread of memory, a path stitched through the desert by centuries of travel, known as much to the elders' minds as to their feet. There are no signposts, no markers carved in stone. Instead, the land itself becomes the map, the shape of a ridge, the way the wind piles the sand against a certain cliff, the color of the rock in the early morning light. They begin their journey before the sun rises, when the desert is still wrapped in its cool night breath. The camels shift and groan softly as they kneel for loading, their eyes half closed as if reluctant to leave the comfort of stillness. Leather water skins are strapped tight, baskets of dried dates are secured, and rolls of woven rugs are tied to the saddle frames. The first steps into the dark are guided by the stars. The lead rider, often the oldest with sharp enough eyes to read the constellations, keeps watch on the shifting sky, knowing which stars lead to safety and which will guide a traveler into nothingness. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a pale, glowing river, a reminder that every journey is vae, just another crossing of a greater sea dot by the time the first line of gold appears on the horizon. The caravan is already deep into its march. The cool air begins to thin, and the first heat seeps into the sand beneath their feet. The camels plod forward in a steady rhythm, their shadows stretching long and thin behind them. Conversation is rare in these hours. Words seem to dissolve. In the dry wind, by midday, the sun becomes a weight. The sky turns white with brightness, and the dunes seem to shift and sway like living creatures. Travelers wrap their heads and faces in cloth, leaving only their eyes exposed. Every motion is deliberate, each sip of water measured, for in the desert, carelessness can vanish a life as easily as the wind erases a footprint. The road between oases is not only a test of endurance, but of trust. Trust in the leader to find the next water source, trust in the animals to bear the load without faltering, trust in the old stories that say, beyond the dunes lies shade. When they finally glimpse the dark green shimmer of palm leaves in the distance, it is like seeing a small piece of heaven laid gently on the earth. Approaching the oasis is a slow, cautious act. Sometimes the heat itself makes mirages, and what looks like water from afar is nothing but air and light. But when the ground begins to show traces of dampness and the scent of growing things rides on the wind, they know they have arrived. The first sound is often the bubbling of a spring low, and quiet beneath the hum of cicadas. The water is cool, tasting faintly of the earth it has traveled through. Hands cup it, lips touch it, and for a moment the desert's harshness melts away. Under the shade of date palms, the tribe unpacks, their bodies relaxing in a way they could not in the open sands. The camels are allowed to drink and rest there, knees folding with a sigh of relief. Children run barefoot in the dust, their laughter echoing against the still water. Women set to work preparing food, thin flatbreads roasted on stones, sweet dates mashed into a thick paste, and a stew of lentils and goat meat simmered with herbs gathered along the way. Night comes differently at the oasis. Instead of the open wind, there is the rustle of leaves. Instead of endless stars, some are hidden by palm fronds swaying gently overhead. The fire is lit again, as it always is, and for a few days the tribe can live as if the desert beyond were only a story, told to warn the young, yet the road always calls again. The next trade, the next pasture, the next meeting with distant kin, all lie beyond the horizon. And so, once rested, they will pack the camels again, take one last drink from the spring, and step back into the shifting sea of sand. Trade in the desert was never just the clinking of coins or the swapping of goods. It was, above all, an act of trust, a quiet agreement between strangers who might never meet again, yet whose survival depended on mutual respect. For the nomadic tribes, markets were not permanent stalls under tiled roofs, but brief, shimmering gatherings at crossroads, where caravan routes converged like veins of life in the barren land. These meetings were rare and often unplanned, yet everyone knew the unspoken rules. A patch of flat ground, often beside a known well or a cluster of acacia trees, would become a market for a single day, sometimes even just a few hours. There were no walls, no banners, no shouting merchants, hawking wares. Instead, trade was a slow-moving current of gestures, glances, and the soft rustle of cloth being unfolded to reveal treasures from faraway lands. One caravan might arrive with bundles of salt, drawn from ancient mines deep in the desert's heart, white as bone and heavy with value. Another might bring spices from distant coasts, cinnamon, cardamom, and dried ginger, each wrapped in layers of linen to preserve its perfume. Others came with copper ingots, carved wooden bowls, polished beads of carnelian, or jars of honey. Thick as amber dot, there was no fixed price for anything. Instead, a kind of wordless conversation would unfold. A trader would place his goods on a rug, step back, and wait. Another would examine the items, weighing them in his hands, feeling their texture, smelling their scent. He might then place something of his own beside them, perhaps a sack of grain, or a leather water-skin, or a bolt of indigo-dyed cloth. The first trader would consider the offer, sometimes nodding, sometimes shaking his head slightly, or adding another object to balance the valued dot. It was a rhythm, a dance, no loud bargaining, no dramatic refusals. Only the slow shaping of a deal until both parties gave a small, final nod, a gesture as binding as any spoken oath. But trade was not just about goods. It was the bloodstream of news across the desert. Stories traveled alongside salt and spice, of a drought far to the east, of a new well discovered by a wandering shepherd, of a wedding between two distant clans, of dangers along certain routes. These were exchanged freely, for in the desert, information was as life-saving as water dot. Some tribes had their own subtle systems to communicate during trade without revealing too much to outsiders. A certain way of folding a rug before placing goods on it could mean the trader was open to barter for animals rather than food. The way a water-skin was set down upright or on its side might tell a partner whether the trader was desperate or simply curious. While the day was for trading, the night after was for hospitality. No one left a trading ground without being offered food, tea, or at least a place near the fire. It was said among the elders, in the desert, even your rival is your guest when the sun has set. And so, beneath the starlit sky, strangers shared bowls of dates, roasted meat, and spiced tea, their shadows flickering together against the firelit dot. By morning, the market would be gone as if it had never existed. The ground would be bare again, save for faint footprints and the ashes of last night's fire. The caravans would split apart, each carrying away not only goods, but also the faint memory of human warmth in a vast impersonal land. The desert speaks, though its voice is never loud. It whispers across the dunes, hums through the canyon walls, and sighs over the scattered stones. To the ancient tribes, the wind was not simply a passing breeze. It was a messenger, a warning, and sometimes a guide. Tonight we will sit quietly with them, listening as they listen, letting the meaning of the wind unfold in slow, patient waves. Imagine the faint stirring of air before sunrise, It is not yet warm, but the darkness has begun to loosen its grip. The first breath of wind carries a faint scent, dry earth, a trace of distant plants, the coolness of the night lingering in its touch. The elders would rise then, not hurriedly, but with the slow certainty of those who know the desert's rhythm. They would stand at the edge of the camp, close their eyes, and feel the way the air moved against their skin. A soft wind from the east could mean the day would be clear, the sun's heat steady and without storm. But a gust from the south, warmer, even in the early hours, might hint at a change, perhaps dust traveling far ahead of a sandstorm, or heat waves shifting the dunes. The most feared was the sudden, restless wind from the west, for it could bring the Sam, the wind of fire, that scoured the skin and blinded the eyes with stinging sand. The tribes had no written words for this language. It was passed in gestures, in brief remarks around the fire, in the way a man tightened the ropes of his tent before sleep. Children learned it not from lessons, but from years of watching their elders pause, turn their faces to the horizon, and listen. The wind also told of movement, the kind not seen but felt. A subtle shift in the air could carry the faintest hint of animals moving many miles away. The sharp, dry bite of the wind might mean rocks had been disturbed, perhaps by a predator on the hunt. A soft, almost sweet fragrance could come from a patch of flowering desert shrubs, signaling water nearby. And the sound, the wind had its own music. In the high dunes it hissed gently, like sand pouring slowly from a jar. Between rocky cliffs it howled in deep, hollow notes, carrying with it a sense of distance. In the narrow canyons where few dared to linger, it could whistle sharply, echoing in a way that made it impossible to tell how near or far it truly was. Some said those were the voices of spirits, warning travelers away from dangerous places. Others claimed they were the laughter of unseen beings, leading the curious astray. The desert tribes treated such beliefs with quiet respect. Whether one thought the wind truly held spirits or simply carried the earth's own voice, it was not to be ignored. Before a caravan set out, the leader would stand apart for a time, feeling for the wind's message. If it came steady and calm, the journey might begin. If it shifted restlessly, the leader might delay. Even if the skies were clear, the wind could be a friend as well as a warning. On long, hot marsh, a steady breeze was like a blessing, cooling the skin and carrying the dust away from tired faces. At night, a gentle wind could keep the camp safe from biting insects and carry the sound of approaching strangers long before they arrived. Some storytellers even spoke of moments when the wind had saved lives, blowing away the tracks of a small hunting party before hostile riders could follow them, or carrying the scent of smoke to warn of a far-off fire dot in the quiet hours. When the stars shimmered like scattered embers, the wind's touch could be almost tender. Children lying on mats could hear it brushing against the tent's fabric, a soft, constant sigh that lulled them to sleep. Mothers might hum along with it, their voices blending with its gentle rhythm. The wind was not only a part of life, It was woven into the very idea of home. No matter where the tribes' tents were pitched to the desert tribes, listening to the wind was as natural as breathing. It was not an art to be mastered, nor a skill to be measured. It was simply part of living in harmony with the land. And so, night after night, generation after generation, the tribes listened, their stories carrying forward the memory of what the wind had once told them. Before the cities, before the roads, there were only the shifting sands and the people who called them home. Through endless heat and the coldest of desert nights, the desert tribes learned to live where few could survive. Tonight we will walk slowly with them, step by quiet step, feeling the dry wind on our faces, and listening for the quiet stories carried by the dunes. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of an endless sea. But there is no water here. The waves are of sand, cresting and falling in curves of gold and pale white, shifting each day beneath the patient hand of the wind. The horizon stretches so far that your eyes lose their place. There is no tree, no hill, no river to break the day. Line only the sky above and the earth below, meeting in a distant shimmer. It is a land where the sun commands by day and the moon reigns at night, and between them, life learns to bend but not to break. The desert has always been more than an empty space. To those who live within it, the desert is a teacher, a giver and taker, a guardian and a judge. The ancient tribes who wandered its breadth knew that every breath of wind, every ripple in the sand, carried meaning. A shift in the dunes might mean a path was opening or closing. The pattern of stars overhead might tell when to travel and when to rest. A certain taste on the wind, dry, sharp, with a faint metallic edge, might mean a storm was coming. These tribes did not build their homes from stone and wood in the way river civilizations did. Instead, they carried their homes with them, animal hides, woven mats, and poles that could be taken down in moments and packed onto camels or donkeys. The shelter was not meant to conquer the land, but to yield to it, to be light, quick, and ready to move. The desert, after all, does not wait. The sand shifts, the waterholes dry, and a place that was safe 1 month might be a trap the next dot by day. The sun could press against the skin like a heavy hand, draining the strength from every muscle. The tribes knew the secret to this was not to fight it, but to move with it. They traveled in the cool hours, dawn, dusk, and sometimes beneath the stars, resting in the day's fiercest heat. The heat was not their enemy, but a fact of life, as much a part of the rhythm as the seasons themselves. And the nights, oh, the desert nights, cold in a way that bites through cloth and skin, reminding you how thin the line is between life and death. The same land that burned you in daylight would steal your warmth in darkness. It was here that the fires of the tribes burned low and steady, not roaring, but glowing like quiet hearts in the sand. Around them, families gathered in close, wrapped in woven wool and fur, voices lowered to match the stillness. They spoke in stories of ancestors who crossed the great dunes without water for 3 days, of caravans that disappeared into the dust and returned with riches from lands beyond imagining, of spirits said to live in the wind and guide or mislead those who wandered too far from the path. Water was the thread that tied their lives together. It was not simply something to drink, it was life itself, guarded, respected, and never wasted. A small leather pouch of water could be the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming a ghost beneath the sand. The tribes knew every hidden spring and every place where rain might briefly pool after a storm. They remembered these places not on maps, but in stories, songs, and the memories of elders. When the time came to move, they followed these memories like a map written on the mind. Food, too, had its own rhythm. The tribes lived on what the desert gave, dates from the hardy palms that could root in scarce water, milk from goats and camels, the occasional meat of a hunted gazelle or hare. Grains were a treasure, brought in from distant markets after long caravan journeys. Everything was valued, everything shared. In a place where survival often depended on the group, generosity was as important as strength. The desert tribes were not without beauty. Their garments, often woven from wool or soft and animal hides, were dyed with deep reds, rich blues, and earthy browns, the colors standing out against the pale gold of the sands. Jewelry of silver and bronze caught the light, and patterns in cloth told of which tribe a person belonged to, or of the journeys they had made. To the desert people, beauty was not a luxury. It was a way to carry light and color into a world of vast, unbroken tones. The children of the desert grew up with the wind as their lullaby and the stars as their ceiling. They learned early to read the land, to feel the subtle changes in the air, to find direction in the constellations. To them, the desert was not empty. It was alive, full of voices, movements, and signs. A fresh trail in the sand might mean a herd was near. A certain flower blooming meant water was hidden somewhere nearby. Every detail mattered. And then there were the caravans. Long trains of camels laden with goods from far-off lands, silks, spices, tools, and ornaments, moving like slow rivers through the dunes. The desert tribes often guided these caravans, for they knew the safe paths and the dangers to avoid. Sometimes the caravans brought news of distant wars or strange inventions. Other times they brought nothing but trade. Yet always they brought the reminder that even here, at the heart of what seemed like nowhere, the world was connected. In the quiet hours of the night, after the fire burned low, the wind would whisper against the walls of the tents. The stars, brilliant and countless, seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in the distance a camel might shift its weight, a soft bell tinkling from its neck. A baby might cry and be hushed with a gentle song. The desert breathed, and the tribe breathed with it. This was life among the ancient desert tribes, patient, watchful, and in harmony with a land that gave nothing freely, but could give everything to those who listened. The sands were not merely crossed. They were lived in, known, and loved in their own way. And as the centuries passed, These people carried their traditions like the water they guarded, carefully, steadily, from one generation to the next. Long before the sun surrendered to the cool embrace of night, the heart of the desert camp began to glow. It was not made of stone or carved by human hands. It was made of embers, the fire at the center of the tribe's circle. Around it, every night of every season, life quietly gathered, dot by day. The desert was wide and open, scattering the tribe's members into the dunes and valleys, each on their own errands, tending animals, scouting for water, gathering herbs. But as twilight stretched its fingers across the sands, they returned one by one, as if the fire's unseen pull guided them home. It always began small. A few dry twigs, a wisp of smoke, the careful coaxing of flame. Then, with a single breath, from the one tending it, the fire would catch, blooming like a desert flower after rain. Its light, a soft and steady gold, spilled outward over the circle of rugs and low cushions laid on the sand. The fire was more than warmth. It was memory. It was safety. It was the place where elders spoke, where deals were made, where children learned the patterns of the world not from books, but from the slow rhythm of stories told under the stars. Elders took their places closest to the fire, the heat easing the ache in their bones. Beside them, the middle-aged warriors and traders leaned on their spears or sat cross-legged, quietly sharing the day's events. The youngest children, sleepy and restless all at once, curled near their mothers, their faces lit in flickering amber light. Above, the sky stretched like a deep, endless sea, studded with stars so bright they seemed to hum in the stillness. The only sounds were the crackle of wood, the murmur of voices, and the soft rustle of wind moving over the dunes. Even the animals gathered at the edge of the camp seemed to listen. The fire's role was not merely practical, though it kept away the cold and predators alike. It was a living thing in the minds of the people. Fed each night, guarded through storms, it was never left to die without ceremony. In the heart of the tribe's lore there were tales of the first flame, stolen from the sun by a wanderer, had walked for 40 days without rest, carrying it back in a clay pot to light the first camp. Whether the story was true or not did not matter. The fire was treated as if it were that same sacred flame, passed from one night to the next. Meals took shape around it. A pot of spiced lentils simmered in the glow, the air thick with the fragrance of cumin and roasted grain. Flatbreads puffed and browned on hot stones set just inside the edge of the fire, their steam mingling with the rising sparks. Hands passed wooden bowls around the circle, and the taste of the food seemed richer in that light than it ever could in the brightness of day. But more than food, the fire gave the gift of togetherness. Even the most distant traveler, even the quietest of strangers, would find a place in its circle. Its light erased the shadows between people, making every face part of the same warm glow. Stories, laughter, even silence, all were welcome here. When the night deepened and the conversations grew slower, someone would always stir the coals, sending a brief fountain of sparks into the sky. It was as if the fire was answering the stars, a small reminder that Earth too had its own lights. Eventually, one by one, the people would drift toward their tents, leaving the last few to keep the embers alive until dawn. And so the fire remained steady, patient, waiting for the next evening, when once again the desert would gather at its side. Night in the desert does not fall so much as it arrives, sudden and deep, as though a great curtain is drawn across the sky. One moment the horizon still holds a faint band of gold, and the next the sun has vanished, leaving the world in a velvet shadow. Yet in that darkness life begins to glow, not from the moon, though she reigns overhead in her cold silver light, but from the small fires blooming across the sand. These fires were the heartbeat of nomadic nights. They were never large. Wood was precious, and the desert gave it only sparingly. A few gnarled branches of acacia or tamarisk, a bundle of dried camel dung, or sometimes twisted roots carried from afar. These were enough to feed the flames. The glow was warm but gentle, a fragile bloom against the vastness of the night. The fire was never just for heat. It was a place where the day ended and stories began. Men and women would gather, drawing close on woven mats or worn sheepskins, the younger ones nestled against their elders. The desert wind might hiss past the tents, rattling the ropes and flapping the fabric, but here around the fire there was a stillness, a shared breath. Voices would rise in soft rhythm, sometimes in song, sometimes in the chanting of old tales. These were not hurried words. The desert stories were long and winding, told in a slow, measured cadence, so that each image could take root in the listener's mind. Some stories were so ancient that no one remembered their beginning. Tales of the first well, the lost caravan, the two brothers who followed the stars. Children listened wide-eyed, their faces flickering between shadow and flame. Elders spoke, with pauses long enough for the wind to pass between sentences. And when the stories ended, there was always a stretch of silence, as if the night itself was allowed to settle the words into the sand. The fire was also a place of quiet work. Women mended cloaks by the light, their fingers moving with calm precision. Men sharpened tools or polished saddles, the slow scrape of a whetstone blending with the crackle of the embers. Some would brew tea, black, bitter, and strong, pouring it from high above the cup so that the stream caught the firelight as it fell. Others roasted thin bread on iron plates, the air filling with the scent of smoke and grain. From time to time the fire would lean low, its flames bowing in exhaustion. A hand would reach to feed it, not too much, never wastefully, only enough to keep it alive until the night's end. In the desert, a fire was a companion, and one never let a companion die before its time dot above it all. The sky spread wider than any tent could dream of. Stars in the desert are not the scattered pinpricks of the city sky. They are an ocean, bright and uncountable, pressing down like the gaze of ancient gods. Travelers could read the constellations as others might read a map, tracing the paths. Their ancestors had walked for centuries, A hand might rise to point at a familiar pattern, the hunter, the water carrier, the seven sisters, and a story would begin anew. When the embers finally sank into a low red glow, the night would be nearly spent. Some would drift to sleep wrapped in blankets, the fire's last warmth on their faces. Others would remain awake, watching the stars until the first pale ribbon of dawn began to unravel in the east dot, and so it went, night after night, for centuries. The same small circle of light under the same unending sky, holding back the darkness with flame, story, and the simple presence of one another. In the desert, a well was never just a hole in the ground. It was a place where time pooled as tangibly as water itself. Some were shallow, dug by hand in the coarse sand, lined with woven reeds and stone to keep the earth from swallowing them. Again, others were older than memory, their edges worn smooth by generations of hands and ropes, their origins forgotten, spoken of only in stories that drifted like wind-blown dust. These wells stood in the emptiest stretches of land, far from any shelter, marked only by a circle of stones and the faint, dark stain of damp earth. Approaching a well was never done lightly. The first sign was the sudden change in the air, the way the wind seemed cooler, heavier, as if carrying the scent of water hidden deep below. Often it was the animals that sensed it first. Camels would raise their heads, ears twitching, hooves shifting in a restless dance. Goats would bleat, the sound sharper, more insistent. The tribe would arrive in a slow, deliberate procession. The elders stepped forward first, leaning on carved staffs, their eyes tracing the ground for any changes since the last visit, a fallen stone, a new crack in the lining, a rope frayed from long use. Wells were fragile things. In the shifting sands they could vanish in a single storm swallowed overnight by a dune. Drawing water was a ritual. The rope would be uncoiled with care, its knots checked, its fibers smoothed between calloused fingers. The bucket, sometimes wood bound with metal, sometimes only a stitched skin bag, would be lowered into the darkness. You could hear it descend, the sound fading until it met the faint splash far below. Then came the slow pull upward, the rope heavy now with the weight of life itself. When the bucket emerged, droplets clung to its sides, shining in the sun like tiny jewels. The first cup was always for the animals. Then came the children, who drank in quick, eager swallows. Adults sipped more slowly, their faces still, as if trying to memorize the taste. Desert water was never taken for granted. Every mouthful was a reminder of what it had taken to find it. Many wells had names, not just for convenience, but because they were treated as companions almost as elders themselves. There was the Mother of Stones, whose sides were lined with smooth pebbles, said to have been laid by the first wanderers. The Singing Well, whose depths hummed softly when the wind was right. The Shadow's Eye, hidden in a hollow where the sun never touched the water directly. Stories said that some wells were gifts from the sky, opened by lightning strikes or revealed in dreams. Others were guarded by spirits who watched over the water and punished those who drew more than they needed. Even the most practical among the tribe would lower their voices near a well, speaking with the same quiet respect one might offer to an ancestor Dot in times of drought, when other wells ran dry. A single deep one could save an entire caravan. Men would ride for days to reach it, arriving with lips cracked and eyes clouded by heat, yet leaving with skins full and spirits lifted. They would speak of it for months afterward, the taste lingering in their memory long after it was gone. And when the tribe moved on, the well remained, a patient, unblinking presence in the desert's vast emptiness, waiting for the next travelers to come. It was said that the desert kept its own form of memory. Winds might erase footprints, dunes might bury paths, but the wells endured. They were the quiet witnesses to centuries of footsteps, the fixed points in a land that was otherwise always moving. In the desert, the wind was not only a force, it was a presence. It moved through the dunes with the patience of an old storyteller, carrying secrets, erasing trails, and shaping the land without a single visible hand. To live among the tribes was to accept the wind not as an enemy, but as a companion that arrived unannounced, lingered as it pleased, and departed without farewell. There were many kinds of wind, and each had a name. The elders spoke of them as one might speak of old friends, the cool dawn breath that whispered through tents before sunrise, the restless midday gusts that tugged at robes and scattered cooking fires, the heavy sand-laden tempests that roared like drums in the dark. They believed that the winds had moods, playful, angry, thoughtful, and that they could be read if you listened closely enough. When the wind came softly, brushing the dunes in slow ripples, it was a comfort. It cooled the skin after a long march and carried the scent of distant things, the faint trace of blooming desert flowers after rare rains, the sharper bite of smoke from a camp still beyond the horizon, or the metallic tang of a sandstorm on its way. The tribes would sit in the open during such moments, letting the breeze pass over them, closing their eyes as if greeting an old friend. But when the wind rose in anger, the desert changed. Curtains of sand would race across the horizon, swallowing shapes, turning the world into a pale, trembling blur. In such times the tribe moved as one. Camels were brought close, their heads wrapped in cloth. Tents were tightened and anchored deep into the sand. Children were gathered under the strongest coverings, where the sound of the storm was muffled to a deep, steady thrum. The wind would howl and scrape at the fabric, rattling poles as if testing the resolve of those who lived beneath it. Yet even in its fury, the wind was not seen purely as a threat. Many said it was a cleansing, sweeping away old tracks, smoothing rough places, revealing hidden things buried for years. Sometimes, after a storm, a caravan would find the faint curve of an ancient pot, the blackened stones of a forgotten hearth, or even the bones of travelers from another time. The wind was both destroyer and discoverer. The desert tribes often spoke of the wind as a guide. In the stillness of night, they claimed, a certain breeze could lead a lost traveler toward water or shelter. Some swore that in their loneliest Moments they had heard voices within the wind, not words exactly, but murmurs of comfort, reminders that they were not entirely alone. Others said the wind could carry messages between camps far apart, the air itself acting as a silent courier. Songs were made for the wind, slow and low, sung into its currents, so the words might travel farther than any writer. Children learned to tilt their heads and listen for changes, the way the pitch of the air shifted as it moved through a canyon, or the sudden stillness that meant a storm's eye was passing overhead. The wind also shaped how the tribes moved. Caravans would ride with it, letting it push them forward, or against it, leaning into its resistance with determination. It could cool a journey or turn it into an ordeal. Maps were drawn in memory and in story, not on parchment, because the land the wind touched was never quite the same twice. For all its unpredictability, the tribes trusted the wind. They built their lives in its presence, carried its song in their sleep, and allowed it to decide sometimes where they would be the next day. In a land where there were no rivers and no forests, it was the wind that gave the desert its voice. And at night, when the stars burned cold above, the wind would settle into a low, steady hum, moving around the tents like a watchful guardian. You could fall asleep to it, wrapped in furs, knowing that even in the vast emptiness, something was moving just outside, something that had been moving since the beginning of time. In the desert, a fire was more than light and heat. It was a gathering place, a promise, and sometimes a declaration to the night itself. We are here, and we are not afraid. When the sun had gone, and the chill crept swiftly across the sand, fires became the center of every camp. They were built carefully, for wood was precious. A traveler from wetter lands might imagine the desert empty of fuel, but the tribes knew where to find it. Dried palm fronds carried from distant oases, thorny acacia branches gathered on long journeys. Even the slow-burning roots of shrubs that clung stubbornly to the sand dot in the open dunes, where nothing blocked the horizon, a fire's glow could be seen for miles. This was both a comfort and a risk. Friends could find you by it, but so could strangers. Some tribes placed smaller, hidden fires behind dunes, using the wind to mask the smoke, while others welcomed the attention, letting the flames stand as a beacon. Around the fire, the air always felt different. Even on the coldest nights there was a softness in its reach, a warmth that wrapped around hands, faces, and the tight circles of those who sat close. Shadows danced against the curve of the dunes, growing and shrinking as the flames shifted, turning the desert into a theater where every flicker told a story. Stories were, in fact, the fire's true work. In the dark, voices carried better, and the night seemed to listen as elders spoke of the great caravans, of lost cities buried beneath the sand, of ancestors who crossed whole lifetimes of dunes without losing their way. The younger ones listened, eyes half closed, letting the firelight blur into dreams. Food, too, became part of the fire's quiet magic. Flatbreads baked on hot stones, their edges crisping in the heat. Dates warmed just enough to release their sweetness. Tea brewed slowly, its scent carried on the wind. In those moments, with the stars hanging silent above and the desert stretching endless beyond the reach of light, the fire made the vastness feel small, contained, almost gentle. Sometimes the tribes lit fires simply to keep watch. The flames kept away certain animals, and though the desert was not crowded with predators, the knowledge that the camp was lit gave everyone ease. Guards would sit on the edges of the light, eyes scanning the dark, while the fire whispered and crackled. Behind them, there were nights when the wind would rise, and the fire became a test of patience. Sparks would race away, sand would swirl into the flames, and keeping it alive required constant care. But the desert people were skilled at sheltering their fires, building small walls of stone or arranging saddles and packs in a tight ring, creating a calm pocket where the flame could breathe. In some traditions, the last ember was as important as the first spark. At dawn, when the camp prepared to move, a sliver of the fire was kept glowing in a clay pot, carried carefully on the next leg of the journey. That ember could start the next night's flame, linking one evening to the next in an unbroken chain of warmth across the miles. For all its simplicity, a fire in the open dunes was a reminder, and a place that could be so cold, so empty, the smallest light could hold the night at bay. And as the desert tribes knew well, sometimes all you needed was a little heat, a little glow, and the comfort of knowing you weren't alone in the dark. To most eyes, a desert is empty, an endless stretch of sand and stone that hides all signs of life. But to those who call it home, the ground is full of words, each mark and shadow a sentence in the silent language of survival. Footprints in the sand, fragile as they seem, can tell a story more clearly than speech. In the first pale light of dawn, when the wind has not yet stirred, the sand is still smooth and untouched. It is then that the elders walk the edges of the camp, scanning for the faint arcs of movement. A camel's broad pad leaves a deep, rounded print. A goat's hoof cuts two sharp crescents. Human steps are lighter or heavier, depending on their load, their pace, and even their mood. The desert tribes read these signs as one might read an old, familiar book. A line of prints leading away from an oasis might speak of travelers leaving. In haste, their heels cutting deep, the stride stretched wide. Another path with light, careful impressions might tell of a hunter moving quietly toward a sighting. Sometimes the wind erases the middle of a track, leaving only the first few steps and the last, a mystery to puzzle over, a tale without its middle. Children are taught early to see what others overlook. A scatter of sand where it should be smooth could mean a lizard darted past at night. A pattern of small, evenly spaced pits might be the passing of a snake, its body leaving a soft, wavering line beside them. The smallest details matter. The depth of the print reveals the weight carried. The angle of sand at the toe shows whether the walker climbed uphill or descended. Even the way the edges crumble can tell how long ago the steps were made. This knowledge was not just for curiosity. In the desert, following the wrong trail could mean days wasted and water lost. Traders learned to track friendly caravans by the unique wear on their camels' feet, while scouts watched for prints that hinted at raiders. A skilled tracker could follow a trail across shifting ground, finding the faintest indentations in hard-pan soil, or noting where a few grains had fallen differently from the rest. There was a kind of poetry in it, too. Lovers might leave messages in the sand for each other, a small spiral to mean wait, or a circle crossed twice to mean safe. Friends separated by distance could mark their path in a way that only their own people understood, the prints becoming private letters between camps. Yet the desert was also a master of erasure. By midday the wind could sweep the dunes clean, wiping away every step as though no one had ever passed. This was both a blessing and a warning. It kept the land open for new journeys, but it also reminded the tribes that in the desert, memory is carried in people, not in the ground. Sometimes, after a night of storms, the sand revealed prints that were not fresh, the fossilized steps of animals long gone, or strange patterns left by shifting stones. Elders would gather the young and tell them stories about the ones who walked there before, whether human, beast, or spirit. The footprints became more than signs. They became a bridge between the present and the past. To the untrained eye, the desert may always look silent. But for those who learned the language of footprints, every path, every faint curve of sand was alive with meaning. And as long as someone could still read those messages, the desert would never truly be empty. In the desert, water is not just a resource. It is a thread holding life together. Every drop is a promise, a bond between people and the land. Among the tribes there were places whispered about in low tones, places known only to a few, hidden, wills buried deep within the dunes, their exact location guarded like a family's most precious heirloom. Unlike the rivers of green lands or the lakes that shine openly under the sun, these wells were secret and still. Some were ringed with stone, their mouths narrow, descending into the earth through centuries-old hand-carved steps. Others were simply holes in the ground, capped with slabs to keep out drifting sand. To stumble upon one by chance was rare. The desert did not give up its treasures easily. A well was not always where logic might place it. It could lie in the middle of a broad, empty stretch of sand with no sign of life around it. But those who understood the land could see its hints. A cluster of hardy tamarisk trees clinging to the edges of a dune, or a patch of green reeds swaying stubbornly in a hollow. These signs were read as carefully as footprints, for they pointed to the earth's hidden veins. The first sip from a desert well was always slow. People knelt, cupping their hands, and let the cool water rest on their tongue before swallowing. It was said that the well would remember how it was treated. Those who rushed greedily might find its water turning brackish in time, while those who drank with respect found it sweet and enduring. Elders told such things not as superstition, but as a way of teaching reverence for the gift beneath the sand. The act of drawing water was a ritual in itself. A leather bucket, darkened by years of use, would be lowered carefully, the rope creaking softly. The sound of it striking the water's surface was one of the most comforting noises in the desert, a deep, echoing splash that meant safety. Children would lean over the edge, watching the bucket sway, and imagine the deep darkness below as a secret underground lake where ancient spirits swam slowly in the coolness. Caravans often planned their routes by these wells, linking them like beads on a necklace across the wasteland. At night, a camp would form near one, the tents set up in a protective half-circle, their open side facing the water. Even the animals seemed calmer there. Camels would kneel quietly, eyes half closed, as if the presence of water soothed them. Wells also served as meeting points. Tribes who rarely crossed paths elsewhere might find each other here, exchanging news, trade, or even peace offerings. In the quiet glow of oil lamps, men and women would sit beside the well, telling stories whose words drifted out across the still air, mingling with the creak of the rope and the drip of water from the bucket. But a well could also vanish. A shifting dune might cover it overnight, or the water table might sink too low for the bucket to reach. When that happened, the loss was mourned almost like the death of a loved one. Songs were sung for it, not because the water itself could hear, but because memory kept the place alive. Some wells had names older than any living person, names drawn from ancient battles, long-lost lovers, or even dreams. A traveler might be told, "Turn east until you reach the well of the quiet camel," or "Rest at the well of red moonlight." These names were part of the map that existed in the minds of the desert people, a geography carried not in books, but in stories. To the outsider, a desert well was a hole in the ground. To the tribes it was a heart, beating slowly, hidden in the vastness, giving life in a place where life was never guaranteed. And as long as someone remembered its name, its water was never truly gone. In the open desert, silence is never truly silent. If you sit long enough away from the camp, away from the muffled talk of people and the slow breathing of animals, you begin to hear it, the wind. It is not the sharp wind of storms or the roaring gusts that whip sand into the eyes. It is a constant, soft murmur, like a great invisible sea brushing against the dunes. For the desert tribes, this sound was never just the air moving. They heard voices in it, voices that belonged to those who came before, to spirits of the land or to the desert itself, which was said to remember everything it had witnessed. Old men spoke of nights when they could hear a single note, long and low, like a flute played far away. Women spoke of afternoons when the wind seemed to weave itself into patterns, lifting and lowering in a rhythm that matched the sway of camel steps. There were places where the wind's voice grew stronger. A narrow pass between two stone cliffs could hum like a stringed instrument. A hollow between dunes might capture the breeze and let it whirl until it made a tone that lingered even after the gust had moved on. Some of these places became known as the desert's singing gates, and people would travel miles out of their way to sit and listen, believing the sounds brought good dreams or guided the heart toward wise decisions. Children learned early to pay attention to the wind. They would cup their hands behind their ears, tilt their heads, and try to catch every shift in its song. Elders told them, the wind knows where it has been, and it carries the stories with it. If you listen, you will never be lost. It was also believed that the wind could carry messages between camps. When two groups were separated by a wide plain, they would sometimes shout toward the horizon in the hopes the wind would take there. Words further than a human voice could travel. Whether or not the words were truly heard was never certain, but it comforted those who tried not at night when the campfires burned low. Storytellers often began their tales with a nod toward the breeze. This, they would say, was given to me by the wind. The listeners would smile, because they knew that meant the story was not the teller's alone. It belonged to the land. In some tribes, there was a tradition of singing directly into the wind. A person would stand at the edge of the camp, facing the vast open dark, and hum or chant quietly, letting the air carry the sound away. These songs were not meant for other people to hear. They were offerings like a gift to the desert. Sometimes they were thanks for a safe journey. Sometimes they were farewells to a loved one gone. And sometimes they were simply a way to feel less alone under the endless sky. Travelers spoke of moments when the wind seemed to answer. It might change direction suddenly, or grow warmer or cooler, as if acknowledging the person who had sung to it. Those who experienced this never forgot it, even if they told no one. The wind could also deceive. It might mimic the sound of footsteps, making a traveler turn suddenly, only to find the dunes empty. Or it might carry a snatch of laughter or a distant voice, though no one was there. Some believed this was the work of mischievous desert spirits, who liked to remind people of how small they were in the endless sands. But the tribes understood something simple. The desert is never still. Even when you cannot see it moving, it breathes. The dunes shift, the air stirs, and in that movement there is always a sound, carrying the memory of journeys, of camps long gone, of lives lived under the same stars you see now. Those who listen closely say they can hear their own heartbeat in the wind. It comes in softly like a friend sitting beside you, and leaves just as gently, carrying your unspoken thoughts into the distance. And perhaps somewhere far away someone else is listening and hears them. Before the sun rises, the desert is not empty but hushed, as though it has drawn in a long, deep breath and is holding it, waiting for the day to begin. The stars are still scattered above, sharp and cold, while the horizon carries only the faintest smear of light. It is in this hour, between night and morning, that the caravans stir. The first sound is often the low murmur of voices, soft so as not to wake those still sleeping. Then comes the faint shifting of fabric as blankets are folded and packed away. A match is struck or a small spark coaxed from the embers of last night's fire, bringing the first orange glow of the day. The smell of warm bread or boiling tea drifts into the air, mingling with the cool scent of sand before the sun heats it. Camels rise slowly, as if reluctant to leave their rest. Their long shadows stretch in the half-light, legs folding and unfolding. Like pieces of a quiet machine, the handlers move among them, checking straps and saddles, tying bundles, adjusting the balance of the loads. Each motion is practiced, repeated countless mornings before, the slow choreography of people who have lived on the road all their lives. From a distance, a caravan preparing to leave might seem like a single unbroken movement, a ripple of figures bending, lifting, and walking, followed by the swaying shapes of animals. Bells tied to the camels' necks give off a faint, irregular chime, a sound that will become the caravan's heartbeat once the journey begins. As the eastern sky grows pale, the color of pearl, the first rays of sunlight touch the highest dune. Its crest glows faintly gold, like the edge of a coin, while the land below remains shadowed and cool. It is at this moment, the dividing line between night and day, that the caravan begins to move. Walking through the morning desert has its own rhythm. The sand is still cool and firm beneath the feet, the air fresh and light before the heat comes. The travelers speak little. Most prefer to save their voices, letting the steady crunch of steps and the sigh of the wind fill the silence. For some, this is the most peaceful time of the day. Elders say that dawn is a good time to make promises. The desert, still half asleep, will hold those promises until nightfall, when the stars return to listen. For that reason, some travelers whisper quiet vows into the morning air to reach their next destination, to find a lost friend, to return. Home after the long road. Behind the caravan, the camp is already vanishing. The wind smooths away the shallow prints, erasing them as though they had never been there. In the desert, nothing is permanent except the journey itself. As the sun rises higher, the shadows shrink, and the warmth spreads across the dunes. The caravan settles into its pace, a slow, swaying progress that will last until the next resting place. But in that first hour, when the day is still young and the air holds the cool breath of night, the desert feels almost gentle, as if it has agreed to let the travelers pass unharmed. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the shimmer of the horizon, there is always the next well, the next patch of shade, the next night's fire waiting to be lit. The desert, for all its apparent emptiness, hides its most precious treasures deep below the surface. To those who pass through it without understanding, it may seem like a place without mercy, a land where water is an accident, a rare and unpredictable gift. But to the people who belong to it, who have walked its shifting paths for generations, the desert is not cruel. It is simply careful with its generosity. And the wells, the oases, the secret places where water rests are the quiet proof of that. Patience. Before the caravan reaches such a place, there is a change in the air, subtle but noticeable to those who know. The wind shifts, carrying scents it does not usually bear, the faint green of unseen plants, the dusty sweetness of dates ripening in their clusters, and sometimes even the soft, wet coolness of water itself, hidden underground but whispering its presence. The sky looks no different, and the sand rolls on in familiar shapes, but the tribespeople feel it, an undercurrent, a promise. The wells are rarely where you expect them to be. They might be tucked into a hollow between low dunes, their mouths covered by planks or woven mats to keep out drifting sand. Some are ringed by stones, each one worn smooth by countless hands pulling up the rope of the bucket. Others are no more than a dark circle in the earth, edged with wood bleached pale by sun and wind. And there are the oases, larger and more dramatic, where water comes close enough to the surface to feed groves of date palms, tamarisk trees, and stubborn grasses dot. The first sight of an oasis after days of travel is always quiet at first. Even the camels seem to know. Their heads lift, their pace quickens, and their long shadows stretch ahead as though trying to reach the shade before them. The people do not run. Running wastes breath, and water will not vanish in the time it takes to walk to it. But their eyes brighten, their shoulders loosen, and there is an unspoken agreement among them. The journey has earned this pause. When the caravan arrives, the water keepers are often the first to be greeted. These are the ones who guard the wells, not as owners but as stewards. They are respected in every tribe, for without their work, the paths of the desert would be far more dangerous. Some are elders who can read the shifting of the sand like a book, finding hidden veins of water by the patterns of plants or the faint tilt of the land. Others are younger, chosen for their endurance, able to dig for hours in the heat or haul heavy skins of water to those who cannot come to the well themselves. The water-keeper's work is quiet, methodical. They check the ropes for fraying, replace wooden beams worn thin by years of use, and make sure no dust or insects fall into the precious supply. At an oasis they will tend the palms, clearing away fallen fronds and trimming the fruit clusters so that the dates grow sweet. They are also record keepers of a kind, passing on the knowledge of which wells are full in which season, which have turned brackish, which have gone dry and may not return for years. Drawing water is a ritual in itself. The bucket, often a stitched goatskin, darkened by years of use, is lowered slowly into the shadowed mouth of the well. The rope creaks, the pulley groans softly, and then there is a pause, a faint splash far below. The rope is drawn back, hand over hand, the bucket swinging gently as it rises. When it emerges, the water within it catches the light, trembling in its skin, a little pool of sky brought up from the earth. The first to drink are often the elders and the children. The water is poured into wooden bowls or simple clay cups, and it is not gulped but sipped, the way one might listen to a quiet song. Some of it is used to wash hands and faces, to ease the dryness that the desert leaves on the skin. The camels are brought forward in turn, each one lowering its grate head to drink slowly, their long lashes blinking in the shade dot in the cool beneath the palms. The air feels different, not damp exactly, but softened. Shadows ripple on the ground as the leaves sway gently overhead, and the sounds of the caravan mingle with the whisper of wind through the fronds. Meals are unhurried here. Bread baked on flat stones, dates shared from a central basket, tea brewed, and small metal pots whose handles are warm from the coals. Conversations return, voices lifting a little after days of quiet walking. Laughter is rare but not absent. It comes in low, rolling waves, like a warm breeze. Even in this place of rest, the desert is not forgotten. The water keepers remind the travelers not to linger too long, for the sun will rise high and the heat will return. Skins and jars are filled, loads adjusted, and the caravan's path is planned anew. Which route to take, which wells to aim. For next, which dunes to avoid in the shifting season. When the time comes to leave, there is always a moment of stillness. The palms rustle as though in farewell. The surface of the water ripples once, and then the caravan moves away, footprints trailing behind. The oasis remains as it has for centuries, patient, waiting, a green heart and a sea of gold dot to those who live in the desert. Water is not only life, it is memory. Every sip carries with it the taste of places past, the work of hands long gone, and the quiet promise that even here, in the driest of lands, the earth remembers how to give. When the desert sun sinks low, it does not simply fade into the horizon. It pours itself out in long, molten ribbons, stretching across the sky in shades of amber, rose, and deepening violet. The day's heat, which only hours before had pressed down like a weight, loosens its hold. The sand exhales. The air becomes cooler, gentler, as though the desert itself is settling into a slow and careful breath. The caravan halts for the night in a place chosen not for its comfort, for the desert offers few luxuries, but for its safety and shelter from the wind. A low rise of stone, a hollow between dunes, a dry river bed whose edges hold the memory of shade. The camels are made to kneel, their long necks stretching and bowing as loads are unfastened. Leather water skins are set aside, grain sacks laid near the animals, and the heavier baskets stacked in a circle to mark the heart of the camp. Fire is not easy in the desert. Every flame is a small miracle coaxed from scarcity. There is no forest here to offer logs, no fallen branches to gather by the armful. Instead, the tribes collect fuel in the form of dry brush, twisted roots, and the sun-brittled remains of plants that have long since given up their leaves. Even animal dung, dried hard by the sun, is a welcome gift for the fire. The work of Gav, finding it is done during the day, scattered and patient, each small bundle tied and carried until night. The fire is lit slowly, with flint against steel or a glowing ember carried from the last camp. At first it is shy, a single flame leaning into the dark, trembling as though uncertain whether it should grow. But once fed, it begins to settle into its own rhythm, crackling softly, casting a warm light that trembles over sand and skin. Shadows lengthen and bend, leaning in toward the fire's center, as if eager to listen. Around the circle, people sit close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close that the heat bites. They wrap themselves in wool and woven cloaks, the colors muted by both age and dust. Deep reds, faded blues, ochre's the color of sun-baked clay. The smell of the fire blends with the faint sweetness of tea brewing in a small brass pot, its lid rattling gently as the water inside begins to hum. Nearby, flatbread bakes against the inner curve of a pan, blistering and softening in turns. This is the hour of stories. The storyteller is not always the same person. Sometimes it is the elder whose voice has grown thin, but whose memory is sharp as flint. Other times it is a younger member of the tribe who has listened closely enough to remember the words exactly. The first lines are often spoken low, almost as though not meant to be heard by all, a simple hook to draw the listener forward, to lean closer to the fire. Some stories are long and winding, the kind that carry you across the desert without. Moving, leading from the time before the great dunes were born to the reign of forgotten kings whose names now live only in the breath of a tale. Others are short, a memory of a hunt, a lesson in the form of a parable, a joke told in the slow, deliberate cadence of the desert where no one hurries to the punchline. The stars begin to appear, one by one at first, then all at once, as if a hidden hand has scattered them generously across the dark. The desert night sky is unlike any other. It is vast, almost overwhelming in its clarity. Every constellation stands out sharply, and between them lies a depth so dark it feels like a pool without bottom. The elders point to certain stars and tell how they guide the tribe's path, how they mark the seasons, how their movements speak of changes yet to come. The fire burns steadily, its light painting the faces of those gathered, a weathered cheek catching the glow, the glint of an earring shifting with the turn of the head, the soft shine in eyes reflecting both flame and starlight. The children listen with rapt attention until their lids grow heavy, their small bodies leaning against a parent or curling beneath a shared blanket. Now and then, silence falls between stories. It is not awkward but comfortable, like the pause between the beats of a heart. The fire hums, the teapot sighs, the wind moves gently across the dunes, carrying with it the cool breath of night. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire's reach, a camel shifts and grumbles softly. In the distance, the faint cry of a night. Bird rises and fades. These sounds blend into the quiet music of the desert, the kind that asks for no audience and needs no applause. The night stretches on in this unhurried way until the fire settles into embers. A few last words are spoken, good-night wishes murmured under the shared dome of stars. Blankets are pulled tighter, heads rest against saddlebags, and the warmth of the day's stories lingers long after sleep takes hold in the desert. It is said that the fire is a traveler's second son, smaller, humbler, but no less vital. By its light the past and the present meet, and by its warmth strangers become kin for the length of a night. In the desert, the wind is more than a passing breath of air. It is a sculptor, a messenger, and sometimes a thief. It moves unseen, yet leaves its handwriting upon everything it touches. A soft curve of dune, a rippling veil of sand over a caravan track the worn smoothness of a stone that has waited centuries for such patient carving. To those who live among the sands, the wind is as familiar as the sun, though far less predictable dot. It begins gently most days, rising from the cool hours before dawn. At first it is no more than a stirring, the kind that lifts the edge of a tent, flap or sends a few grains of sand tumbling in playful circles. But as the sun climbs higher, the wind begins to grow bolder, gliding over the land as if tasting the air for change. By midday, it has found its voice, not loud but constant, a steady song that hums in the ears and wraps itself around you until you forget the world without it. The tribes read the wind the way others read the clouds or the sea. Its direction tells of weather to come. Its dryness or dampness hints at the promise of far-off rains, and its strength can mean the difference between a day of calm travel and one of struggle. A warm wind from the south might carry the scent of flowers from an oasis in bloom. A sharp, cool wind from the north can be a warning of dust storms gathering in the distance. Invisible but inevitable. Sand is the wind's paint and the dunes are its canvas. Under its touch, the edges of dunes soften, then sharpen again, their lines shifting daily, as though the desert itself is breathing in long, slow movements. The patterns the wind leaves on the surface, tiny ridges like the ripples of water, spirals that vanish as quickly as they are formed, are read by the experienced as a kind of language. Travelers know to rise early and move while the wind is still half asleep. By the time it wakes fully, they will have covered many miles. Still, even the fiercest midday wind carries a strange comfort. It is the constant companion of the desert walker, cooling the skin in the glare of the sun, drying sweat before it, can sting the eyes, keeping away the smallest of flies. But there are days when the wind turns against its companions. It grows impatient, restless. It gathers sand and flings it high into the air, blotting out the horizon, turning the sky to a pale gold haze. It slips into every seam of clothing, every fold of cloth, stinging cheeks and eyes. Camels lower their heads, and people pull scarves tight around their faces, walking as if in a dream where nothing exists beyond the veil of dust. When such winds arrive, the wise seek shelter. They turn tents low to the ground, weighting their edges with stones, and huddle inside until the world beyond fades to nothing but the sound of the wind's furious voice. There is no rushing it. In the desert, you learn that some forces will not be hurried into calm. Yet, even in its harshest moods, the wind is not only an enemy. It carries news, the smell of a far-off rainstorm, the faint call of voices from another camp, the drifting smoke from a fire miles away. In the quiet that follows its passing, the air feels different, cleansed, as though the land itself has been given a fresh start. When evening comes, the wind settles again, curling itself into the folds of the dunes. The patterns it has drawn remain in the sand until another day, when it will rise once more and begin its work anew. Around the fire that night, the elders speak of winds with names, each known for its mood, its gifts, and its dangers. The young listen closely, learning to respect the unseen hand that shapes their world. For those who belong to the desert, the wind is not something to be fought. It is a rhythm to move with, a teacher to heed, a storyteller whose tales are written in drifting sand. The desert is not a place of constant barrenness. Hidden within its vast, whispering emptiness are pockets of life so gentle in their existence that they seem like secrets the earth itself guards. An oasis is one such secret, not a loud oar, proud miracle but a quiet one, revealed only to those who have learned the patient language of the land. At night, the desert holds its breath. The air is cool, the dunes lie still, and even the wind rests in a faint, drowsy hum. But when the first light of dawn spills across the sand, the oasis awakens. The black silhouettes of palm fronds appear against the paling sky, trembling ever, so slightly in the morning breeze. The water, hidden through the dark hours, now mirrors the faintest blush of the coming day, a silver pool beneath the shifting canopy of green. The tribes arrive in silence, their figures outlined by the soft horizon. The camels walk with unhurried steps, their shadows stretching long behind them. Those who come from far-off camps move carefully, as though entering a sacred space. And in a way, it is sacred. In a land where each drop of water has a story, the oasis is more than a resting place. It is a promise kept. Before the sun climbs high enough to burn away the coolness, the work begins. Water skins are lowered into the pool with slow, deliberate movements, so as not to stir the mud beneath. The animals are led to drink in turn, their long necks dipping toward the shimmering surface. Children, still wrapped in sleepiness, crouch at the edges, touching the water as though to be sure it is real. Around the oasis, the air feels different, softer, carrying the sense of damp earth and green leaves. The songs of morning birds echo faintly from the palms, their voices a rare sound in the desert's usual stillness. The grass that grows here under the shadow of the trees is fragile but persistent, bending slightly under the weight of dew. The elders often say that an oasis remembers every person who has ever come to drink. Stories are told of ancestors who found refuge here after days of wandering, of lovers who met in secret under its trees, of travelers who saw its reflection in the heat and thought it a mirage until they stepped into its shade. As the sun continues its climb, the silver of dawn deepens into gold. The palms sway more boldly, their fronds catching the first strong light. The tribespeople fill their water skins to the brim, knowing that each vessel will be guarded carefully on the road ahead. The camels, now content, kneel in the sand, their great bodies resting in the shade. By mid-morning, the oasis has given all it can for the day. The people prepare to leave, footprints marking the once untouched sand. As they depart, the water reflects the empty sky once again, holding within its quiet surface the memories of another morning's gathering. The desert will close around it once more, hiding it from the unknowing. But for those who have knelt at its edge, it will remain in memory, a place where life breathes softly, even in the heart of the sands. There are deserts that stretch so far and so quietly that a traveler could walk for days without seeing the shape of another human. And yet, in the memory of the earth, these spaces have never been truly empty. Long before maps named the roads, they were lines traced by bare feet and padded hooves, worn gently into the sand by those who carried not only goods, but songs, stories, and the rhythms of their tribes. These were the ancient caravan paths, unmarked by stone, yet as real as any road paved in the centuries that followed. The desert wind was a constant companion here. It came in the mornings as a slow sigh, stirring the thin curtains of the tents, carrying the faint scent of distant acacia blooms or the dry, metallic whisper of sand against stone. At midday it grew bold and unrelenting, as if determined to erase every footprint and tire the bones of those who walked. By night it softened again, winding its way through the guy ropes of sleeping camps, nudging the embers in their clay hearths, singing a wordless lullaby to the people who knew its moods like they knew the lines in their own palms. For the tribes who lived and moved across these paths, life was never still. They measured time not in months or years, but in the journeys between one well and the next, in the distance from one patch of grazing land to another. Camels were their silent ships, carrying them across the great beige seas, their feet pressing into the sand with a patient rhythm. And always there was the slow work of loading and unloading bales of wool, amphorae of oil, skins filled with sweet water drawn at dawn, sacks of grain tied with woven rope. The elders told the young ones that the desert did not belong to anyone. It belonged only to itself. You could travel it, learn from it, even live in it for a lifetime, but you could not own it. This belief shaped the way they treated their paths. No tribe sought to fence or mark them. The only signs were the stories told around the fire, passing down the landmarks. A lone rock shaped like a man's head, a patch of earth where the sand was unusually white, the twisted skeleton of an ancient tree that had been dead for centuries, but still stood against the horizon dot at dawn. The caravans rose slowly. First came the sound of water being poured into shallow clay bowls for the animals, then the smell of flatbread baking on thin metal griddles, the dough soft and steaming, torn apart with calloused fingers. Men adjusted the bindings of saddles and checked the balance of the loads. Women rolled up the sleeping mats, their hands moving with quiet efficiency born of repetition. Children ran between the tents, carrying messages or helping with the smallest tasks, their laughter bright against the muted hum of the waking camp. When the sun crept higher, the air began to shimmer with heat. The pace was steady, but never hurried. The desert punished those who rushed. Travelers kept to the shaded side of the animals, switching places as the day wore on, sharing small sips of water from leather skins. Now and then they would pass another caravan coming from the opposite direction, and the leaders would pause to exchange greetings, news of distant oases or warnings of sandstorms moving across the horizon. These meetings could be brief, no more than a few minutes in the vastness Yet they were treasured for the flicker of human connection they brought dot at night. The desert revealed its other face. The heat vanished into the clear darkness, and the stars appeared in such numbers that the sky seemed to be pouring downward. The paths themselves glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if the sand remembered every step taken across it. Around the fires, people told tales of ancestors who had walked these same routes centuries before, their shadows stretching across time. Some spoke of spirits said to guard the wells, others of caravans lost in storms that raged for days without. Pause. The young ones would listen, wide-eyed, to the low voices of the elders, the crackle of burning wood keeping the cold at bay. The desert tribes did not think of themselves as wanderers, though that was how outsiders often described them. They thought of themselves as keepers of a great living memory, a memory written in footsteps, in the grooves of wooden water buckets, in the calloused hands that knew how to pack a camel's load so it would ride evenly for weeks. The caravan. Paths were not only lines across the sand. They were the threads that bound together a world without walls. And so, generation after generation, the winds blew over the same ancient routes. The sand shifted, the stars wheeled, the tents were raised, and taken down, yet the paths endured, invisible to the untrained eye, but clear as day to those who carried them in their hearts. There comes a time each year when the great moving lines of the caravan paths grow quieter, when the tribes, weary from months of travel under the heavy sun, seek the places where the wind is softer and the ground is kinder beneath their tents. These are the winter encampments, not towns, for no walls bind them, yet not mere pauses in the journey either. They are a kind of home built not from stone and timber, but from memory, trust, and the patience of the land. The desert in winter is not the same as the one travelers know in summer. The days are still warm enough to draw a sheen of sweat to the brow, but the nights come early and chill the bones. The sand grows pale, almost silver in the cold light of dawn, and the air smells faintly of wet earth after rare rains. For the tribes, this season is a time of slower movement, of mending the wear and tear of months on the road. Saddles are repaired with fresh leather. Rope is retwisted and strengthened. Worn-out water skins are replaced with new ones sewn by skilled hands. The winter encampments are chosen with care. They lie near deep wells or seasonal springs, where the water is sweet and plentiful enough for both people and animals. Around these places the tents rise in careful circles or crescents, facing inward toward a shared central space where fires burn steadily from dusk until dawn. The largest fires belong to the communal hearths, where thick clay pots simmer with soups made from lentils, wild herbs, and preserved meats. The air is filled with the smell of baking flatbread, the rhythmic clapping sound of dough being shaped, between palms, and the occasional laughter of children chasing each other between the guy ropes. These camps are more than practical refuges. They are gatherings of kin, allies, and distant friends. Caravans that have not seen each other since the spring meet again here, exchanging gifts and news. It is in these months that marriages are arranged, disputes are settled, and alliances are renewed with handshakes and shared meals. The long, cold nights give time for stories that can stretch until the embers glow low. Tales that travel backward through the generations like a caravan, retracing its route dot in one corner of the encampment. The elders sit together, wrapped in thick wool cloaks, their faces turned toward the warmth of a low fire. They speak in unhurried tones about the year's travels, the storms they endured, the oases they found dry, the distant markets where their goods sold well or poorly. Each account is received with murmurs of agreement or quiet laughter, for all know that the desert has its own humor and its own way of humbling even the most seasoned traveler. The animals, too, rest in winter. Camels kneel on padded knees, chewing slowly and watching the world with their unblinking gaze. Goats wander near the edge of the camp, finding what little scrub remains, their bells chiming softly in the still air. Dogs curl up in the shadows of the tents, their ears twitching at every strange sound beyond the firelight. The nights are perhaps the most beautiful part of the winter encampment. The fires burn higher than they do on the road, their light reflecting off the polished brass of cooking pots and the bright beads sewn into ceremonial clothing worn for festivals. Music drifts between the tents, the low thrum of a hand drum, the clear notes of a reed flute, voices rising together in songs that have no written form, only the living memory of those who sing them. These songs are not hurried. They are drawn out with long pauses that let the wind answer back, as though the desert itself is part of the chorus. And beyond the circle of tents, the desert lies quiet under the stars. The dunes are motionless in the moonlight, their sharp edges softened by shadows. Somewhere far off, a fox pads across the sand, leaving no trace of its passing. The tribes sleep under furs and thick blankets, their fires banked, their dreams. Wandering down paths they will walk again when the season turns. Winter will pass, as it always does. The caravans will load again, the tents will come down, the paths will reopen. But for now, in this season of pause, the desert tribes breathe together in the same rhythm, bound by the comfort of the encampment and the unspoken understanding that even in stillness they are always on a journey. There is a quiet in the desert that only the deepest winter nights can summon. It is not the stillness of emptiness, but a layered calm, full of soft, half-heard sounds, the creak of tent poles under the pull of cold wind, the faint shifting of sand grains against each other, the muffled cough of a camel lying in the dark. Beneath this blanket of silence, the tribes settle into a rhythm shaped entirely by the long hours between sunset and sunrise. These are the nights of the sand-warmed hearths, when the desert's breath turns cold and the people draw close to the steady heart of their campfires. Each tent is its own small world. The thick woven walls, made from goat hair spun into coarse, water-resistant fabric, form a shield against the chill. Inside, the floors are layered with rugs so dense they hold the day's warmth like a secret. Here, families gather in a ring around their hearth, which may be nothing more than a shallow pit lined with stones. But in its glow, the whole space feels like a safe and ancient place. Clay oil lamps burn low on the ground, their small flames, steady in the still air. Shadows stretch along the tent walls, bending with each flicker, so that it seems as though the ancestors themselves are leaning in to listen. The meals of these nights are slow and deliberate. Red dough is left to rise near the fire, while soups and stews thicken in heavy pots. Dried fruits are softened in warm water, then folded into sweet porridge. The air inside the tent is a weave of scents: wood smoke, cumin, fresh bread, and the faint tang of the wool blankets draped across shoulders. A steaming bowl passes from one pair of hands to the next, each taking a share, each thanking the one before. In these circles no one eats alone. The elders speak in voices that barely rise above the crackle of the fire. They tell of journeys through sandstorms so fierce that day turned to night, and of finding a lone green shoot in a place where no water was thought to flow. They remember caravans so long that the first camels reached the destination before the last ones had even left sight of the starting point. Their words are slow, unhurried, shaped by a lifetime of walking the desert's winding roads. The young listen, leaning forward, half in awe and half in a drowsy trance from the warmth dot. Sometimes the nights are broken by music. A drum beat begins, low and steady, and someone joins in with the deep notes of a stringed instrument strummed by calloused fingers. A song follows older than the oldest listener, sung in a language of dust and wind. The music is not for dancing, though feet may tap unconsciously. It is for remembering. The melodies seem to rise into the air like sparks climbing up toward the wide dome of stars above, where they will drift until morning. Outside, the camp lies in a perfect balance between light and dark. The fires at the center glow amber, ringed by the pale silver of moonlit sand. The camels rest with their legs folded neatly under them, the younger ones occasionally grumbling in their sleep. Dogs patrol the perimeter, stopping now and then to raise their heads and sniff the wind. If a sound carries from far off, the rustle of a passing animal or the shifting of dunes, their ears twitch, but rarely do they bark. They know the difference between the harmless and the dangerous. The desert itself seems to sleep lightly in winter. The winds are softer, the sky clearer. Nights can stretch into hours of perfect stillness until the eastern horizon hints at dawn with the faintest wash of pale light. Then a slow stirring begins. Embers are coaxed back to flame. The first kettle of tea is set to boil, and its steam curls upward into the cold air. The tents begin to move with life again, the soft rustle of blankets being folded, the hum of early conversation, the creak of leather straps being tightened. But for now, in these long hours before morning, time seems to pause. Wrapped in furs, hands wrapped around warm cups, the desert tribes know that these nights will be remembered not for what happened in them, but for how they felt the rare, complete stillness, the shared warmth, the understanding that even the coldest wind cannot reach where the hearth burns. The empty quarter, Rub al Khali is the name that travelers give to the vast sea of dunes, stretching further than even the most seasoned wanderers care to count. To those who have crossed it, the desert is not truly empty. It is a place of whispers, of shifting patterns, of a life so sparse it hides itself from careless eyes. In the deep heart of winter, when the air turns crisp and the nights lengthen into endless black velvet, the tribes who skirt its edges settle into a rhythm that is almost dreamlike. The camp is pitched at dusk, just as the sinking sun leaves. Streaks of rose and gold along the horizon. The first task is always to raise the tents before the cold arrives. Men and women work together in practiced silence, the poles going up quickly, the woven walls unfurling in the breeze. Children gather dried brush and camel dung for the fires, their small hands quick and sure. The air carries the scent of the desert in winter, sharper than in summer, with a faint mineral tang from the stones hidden beneath the sand. Once the camp is secure, the fires are lit. Here in the empty quarter, wood is precious, so the flames are kept small, just enough to boil water and warm the hands. The rest of the heat comes from the earth itself, sand-heated during the day, still holding the ghost of sunlight beneath the surface. The people dig shallow pits, line them with stones, and build their hearths there. The warmth rises slowly, radiating upward into the circle of gathered figures. The night meal is humble, but deeply comforting. Lentils simmer in earthen pots, spiced with coriander and garlic. Flatbread is baked on a convex griddle, the dough slapping against the metal, with a soft hiss before puffing up and browning in spots. Dates, harvested months before, are pulled from tightly sealed jars and passed around. Every bite is deliberate, every sip of tea drawn out to savor its warmth against the chill. The elders take this time to share stories of their own crossings. They speak of sandstorms that rolled across the horizon like mountains in motion, of wills found just when hope began to waver, of guiding caravans by the position of unfamiliar stars. Their voices are slow, the pauses between sentences filled with the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind against the tent walls. Outside, the desert is transformed by the night. The dunes are no longer gold, but a shifting palette of silver and blue, their crests sharp in the moonlight. The stars here seem impossibly close, as if a single step upward might carry a person into their midst. Constellations are not just points of light, but signposts, maps written across the sky by generations who have memorized every curve and alignment. The Milky Way spills across the heavens like a spilled jar of flour, its dust shimmering faintly in the cold dot in the distance. The wind sometimes stirs the sand into soft veils that drift across the surface like ghosts. A lone camel may lift its head, ears flicking at the sound, before settling back into its rest. The silence here is deep enough to hear the beating of one's own heart, yet it is not oppressive. It is a companion, a blanket of quiet that wraps itself around the camp. Inside the tents, the young lie on layered rugs, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks. They fall asleep to the sound of soft conversation, to the occasional pluck of a stringed instrument, to the rhythm of breathing all around them. Dreams come easily in this warmth, carrying them into imagined journeys, across dunes that glow silver under the moon, past oases hidden in the folds of the sand, towards cities of stone that rise, like mirages in the morning light, and when dawn finally approaches, it comes gently. The stars fade one by one until only the brightest remain. The eastern sky blushes faintly, and the cold grows sharper for a moment before the first warmth of the sun spills over the dunes. Fires are coaxed back to life, tea brewed once more, and the camp begins its slow awakening. The empty quarter still stretches away in all directions, unchanged and eternal. But for those who shared the night here, it will never be just empty. It will be the place where the world fell silent, and the stars leaned close enough to touch.